Hi everybody, my name's Dr. Perry Lin, and today we're going to be doing a lecture on study skills. I'm one of the faculty members in the Department of Internal Medicine here at Mount Carmel West as part of Mount Carmel's health system. A little bit background about myself. I worked for Kaplan Test Prep and Admissions for several years in college, and I'm very passionate about study skills and test-taking strategies. Find a lot of people who make it to this point in their career in which they're training for a very high-level position that requires a lot of further schooling. They make it to this point not based off of their study skills and their test-taking strategies. A lot of people make it this far purely based off the fact that they are extremely intelligent and they're extremely hardworking. And I'm a big proponent of being smart and working hard, but also working smart as well. So we're going to talk about a couple things in this first lecture when it comes to test-taking strategies. We'll start off with the very basics: study hygiene, time management. Where do you study? How do you study? How do you set yourself up for success? And how do you manage your time when you're studying? Is it better to sit there for 8 hours and just power through it, or is it better to do it in 30-minute chunks, 20-minute chunks, 5-minute chunks? Then we're going to go into a little bit of detail in terms of study theory. How do you critically read a textbook? How do you read it so you get the maximum amount of information out? How do you highlight? We know highlighting is not a very effective form of retaining knowledge, and when you talk to a lot of teachers, especially people that look into study skill strategies, they tend to avoid to tell people how to highlight. But there are certain things you can do in highlighting if that's something that you want to do that can optimize your reading retention. How to take notes. This is important. Everyone feels like they know how to take notes, but no one really is good at taking notes. So we'll go through one very common strategy that I like teaching because it's easy to learn, it's quick to learn, and it's something that you can start day one, and it improves your note-taking ability exponentially. And then finally, we'll talk about how to retain that knowledge. How do you remember what you studied? If you're someone who forgets what you read 10 minutes later, a day later, a week later, a month later, those are very important things to address. You need to figure out how do you retain this knowledge for the long term. Because no longer are we talking about knowledge that you're going to use just for a test, to pass a test, so you can make it onto the next level of training. At this point, the knowledge that you're learning is something you're going to utilize for the rest of your career. So it's even more important now than it was in the past when you were in college or high school, that you actually retain what you're learning. And how do we do that? So study hygiene. Starting with the very, very basics, you need to get a good study space. I'm willing to bet if I poll this audience today, a lot of people are studying in their bedrooms. They're studying whenever they have free time. They're studying in a sofa in front of the TV, in some corner, at the kitchen table, someplace where you're utilizing that space for 1,000 other things, and it just happens to be the only open area in your house so you're sitting there and studying. What I am saying is not everybody needs to have a study room. You don't have to dedicate a whole bedroom of your apartment in your house to study, but what you need is a dedicated area. In medicine, we talk about sleep hygiene a lot, setting yourself up for success, using that area only for sleep. Studying is the exact same concept. The area that you have for your study space should only be used for studying. You shouldn't be using that area for reading, for watching TV, for surfing the internet. You need to protect that area. You need to, when you sit down in that corner of the room or that part, that chair at the table, your brain is saying, all right, we're going to get ready to study. Whenever we're here, we focus, we read, we retain, we take notes, whatever that is. Some very, very important parts of study hygiene that people also tend to avoid. Having good light is very important. If you're sitting in a dark room or dark corner of the room, not only is it straining your eyes and hard to read, you get tired, you feel exhausted, you may fall asleep and take a nap. It being in a brightly lit room, in a corner where you have a dedicated study space, that's when you're going to succeed the most. Next, you want to sit upright, but be comfortable. You want to be sitting in a chair. You shouldn't be leaning on the floor. You shouldn't be leaning back on your bed with your pillows propped up. You should have a chair in which you are comfortable. You can sit upright and you can take notes without having to hunch over. You don't want to put yourself in an uncomfortable position because studying is already difficult enough as it is. If you start to associate it with back pain or neck pain or shoulder pain or just a really uncomfortable position, that's going to make it even harder for you to focus on what you need to focus on. This next piece, and I think is so important because a lot of people do this, you want to avoid distractors. In our generation, the biggest distractor I can tell you hands down is your cell phone and the internet. It's not really TV. Very rarely do people sit there with the TV on now when they're studying. But what people do have is they have the internet on their laptop or tablet and it's pulled up to some website, or they're checking their emails, or they get that ping that they have a text message, and suddenly you're breaking away from studying, doing something completely different. When you're studying in your study area, if you do not need the internet to study, the internet should not be on. If you don't need your cell phone to study, which I challenge you, the vast majority of you probably don't need your cell phone when you're studying, turn it off, put it on silent, put it away somewhere. If you're worried someone's going to text you or call you, what I do is I hand my cell phone to my wife and I say, if you get a text message and you think it's important, give it to me, interrupt me while I'm studying, but otherwise just ignore it. I can get back to them. And we've kind of talked about this. You want a quiet place where no one can disrupt you. People have kids, people have pets. You want a place where someone isn't running up to you, poking you in the shoulder all day saying, oh, what about this? Do we need to do this? You need a private area. For me, it's, in my dining room that I study. So my family's everywhere around there. So I let them know when I'm sitting there and I'm studying, I'm not to be distracted. You treat me as if I'm not there. And that's something that once I've explained to my family, once everyone understands, because everyone gets how frustrating it is when you're trying to work on something and someone walks up to you and interrupts you when you're in the zone and you're focusing. Tips that you can use earplugs. If you happen to live in an area that's really noisy, I used to live in Chicago and one of my apartments was right next to the L, and every 5 minutes the L would go by. Use headphones, isolate the noise. Use rooms and doors to your advantage. If you're in a really open room with a hallway that people walk across and there's no door there, turn your desk so you aren't facing that hallway. So you aren't, looking up and suddenly someone walks by. You want to set yourself up for success. Doors, the exact same thing. If you're in a room where you could close the door, that would be the most ideal. That's a very clear message to anyone there. Hey, if you're going to interrupt me, you better have a good reason to do it. Now, the next most important step after having a great place to study is how do you manage your time? A lot of people think they understand time management. Very few people truly actually know how to manage their time, especially when they're studying. People can be very proficient in their everyday life, scheduling everything down to the minute. But when it comes to studying, they don't know how much time they need to study. I'm sure if I were to ask any of you guys today to throw out numbers, how long do you think you can focus with maximal concentration at any given time before you start to get distracted? And I'm willing to bet a very small minority of you would be able to give me a number that's consistent with the research and what we know. There's something called the Pomodoro Technique. This was developed by someone named Cirillo in Italy around the 1980s. He was a programmer and he was kind of a dork when it came to time management. And he came up with this theory about how he found he best utilized his time and he was best able to focus and get his work done. What people have discovered is that this technique is applicable to a very broad base of the population. Now, we're talking about you guys being very highly intelligent individuals. So there will probably be an overrepresentation of people who are able to study and exceed the Pomodoro Technique. But I'm willing to bet even within this group, a lot of you study within this time constraint. Now, the way to figure this out is to focus on when you get distracted. So some of you may be able to say, hey, I can sit at my desk for 8 hours, study nonstop. I did that for all of my tests in college, and I did great. My answer to you is that's great, but that's not the most efficient use of your time. How many of you, when reading a textbook, have been in a situation where you have to go back and reread the paragraph again because you don't even remember what you just read? Or your mind gets distracted and suddenly you're thinking about, oh, what should I have for dinner? Oh, did I email that person back? Oh, I need to remember to call my mom. These are situations that everybody goes through. When you're getting distracted and when you can't retain what you've just read, you aren't focusing. That is wasted time. You might as well take that time and throw it out the window because you could have better spent that time hanging out with your family, walking your dog, or just relaxing and staring out into space. Because that's basically what you're doing. You're trying to force yourself to study in a textbook, but you actually aren't retaining any of that knowledge. So I want all of you to take a second and think about, what is your ideal study interval? What I mean by that is, when you sit down to study and you have a textbook in front of you, how much time can you read for before you get distracted, before your mind starts thinking of something else, before you go back and say, I need to reread that last sentence, last paragraph. Oh man, I can't even remember what I just read for the last page. It's, in one ear, out the other type of situation. I'm willing to bet if you guys sit down and really, really think about it, like if you were to go home today and you were to sit down and start a timer and start reading and stop that timer when you stopped, your ideal study interval is probably 20 to 30 minutes. That is typical of the general population. A lot of people fall in that window. That is when you can, quote unquote, hyper focus. When you're looking at a textbook and everything you're reading is coming in and you are retaining all of it. After that 20 to 30 minute mark, you start to get distracted. Your retention, your study efficiency starts to drop down. This is when people start to worry about, oh man, I need to text that person. Let me grab my cell phone and text. Oh, I need to shoot that email. Let me log on to my email. Oh, let me go read this, article online that someone was telling me about real quick. That is when you're starting to get distracted. And that is a very, very important number to know. It changes for people. I would not be surprised if there's one person in this room that can actually study for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours straight without ever getting distracted. That is a small, small minority in our population. And to that person, I say, congratulations. You are very, very lucky. You may not need this technique, but everyone else is going to. This is how you succeed in studying. So next time you study, I want you to use this technique. This is what you do. You sit down and you focus for your hyper-focusing interval. In this technique, what you do is you can set a kitchen timer for 20, 30 minutes. You can set it on your cell phone, or you can just tell yourself internally, the second I get distracted, I stop. You will find consistently you'll make it about 20 to 30 minutes, and you'll get distracted. As soon as your mind starts to wander, stop studying. Put down your pencil, put down your book, put down whatever you're working on, and go do something else. Take a break for 5 or 10 minutes. This is not a sit there in front of the computer and read something else. This is a break from actually studying. Get out of your chair, go do something. I used to take my dog for a walk around the block because that was pretty much about a 5 or 10 minute walk for us consistently. So he loved it when I studied because the second I got out of the chair, he knew I was taking him outside and we were just going to take a lap around the block, enjoy the weather, spend some time clearing my mind. We'd be back and I'd be back to studying. You want to do this 3 or 4 rounds. What you'll find is that as each round goes on, you're getting more and more fatigued. You either A, will not be able to study as long. Suddenly that 25 minutes turns to 20 minutes, turns to 15 minutes, turns to 10 minutes. And you aren't going to get as refreshed from that break. That 5-minute break turns to a 10-minute break, turns to a 15-minute break. So once you hit about 4 rounds, your body and your brain is going to be fatigued enough that you will need a prolonged break. This is a 15 to 30 minute break. For me, this was a lunch, breakfast, dinner break. This was the break, when I sat down to study at 8 a.m., by the time I made it through 4 rounds, it'd be 10, 11 o'clock. I'd go out, get a snack, maybe grab some breakfast or something, a late brunch, and do something for half an hour that just refreshes me, makes me feel comfortable, and then I can go back and start this all over. You'll find after this 30-minute break that you're going to be able to study again for 25 minutes and feel refreshed after a 5-minute interval. Now, this is like exercise. It's like running a marathon. You can keep taking breaks, but eventually at a certain point, you're going to wear yourself down to the point that your study efficiency is just incredibly low. You spend more times taking breaks and recovering than you do actually studying. Everybody's point for this is different. Most people can make it around 4 rounds of the Pomodoro Technique, 1 big break, and another 4 rounds, and maybe 1 other big break. At that point, you're talking about sitting down and studying consistently for several hours on end. For a lot of people, that is the limit of how much they can study in a day. And that's really pushing themselves. Most people cannot do this consistently day in and day out. Now, a lot of you have made it through med school doing that exact thing. So you may know, yes, I can push myself and study 6 hours a day, every single day, and I'm okay. Not every single person can do that. So some people may, want to set up their studying where they go through the Pomodoro Technique 1 time, or maybe 2 times on weekends, and then take Monday or Tuesday as a break, try again on Wednesday, take Thursday as a break, and then start again Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then take Monday or Tuesday as a break. You want to set up your own schedule based off of this. This is a very flexible schedule. Next step, you know how to study, you know how to use your time, and you know where you're supposed to study. How do you read a textbook? If you take any textbook in the nation and you were to open up the intro, I'm willing to bet about 50% of those textbooks are going to introduce a method called SQ3R. This was a method that was extremely, extremely popular prior to the internet and these new study techniques taking off. It was taught on a regular basis in colleges, in schools, in people who were taking prep classes. And it's kind of fallen to the wayside, which is really, really sad. This technique is how people write textbooks. I'm going to repeat that again. People write textbooks expecting people to read with this technique. If I were to poll the audience today, I'm willing to bet a majority of you never use this technique to read a textbook. So if they write a textbook expecting you to use this technique or a similar technique, and you don't use it, you are not retaining or absorbing that knowledge in the most efficient way possible. They're literally creating for you the best format to retain knowledge if you were to do something like this. Now, what is SQ3R? It's something a lot of you probably are already doing when you're reading. I found a lot of people who make it this far and who are this successful in their academic careers, they tend to have already picked up a few, if not all of these skills, but haven't put a name to it or haven't put a technique to it. So what it is it's survey, question, read, recite, review. You'll hear me talk about a very similar technique when we're going over note-taking. Let's break this down one by one. What does each one mean? Survey. Survey means when you start a chapter, if you look at all textbooks, and you think back to textbooks from when you were in 1st and 2nd grade to all the way to your current textbook that you're reading, there's a very common thread through all of them. There's a chapter heading, there's a section heading, then under the heading, there's paragraphs of information, then there's a table, a picture, a graph, kind of scattered throughout. At the end of each section, there tends to be a highlighted box that has a couple, points or questions or something to review, that hits on the key points. Why do we have that? Because what you're supposed to do when you first look at a textbook is survey. Flip through the pages, skim through the chapter. You want to read the title of each section as you're going through so you know, okay, I'm reading about this main topic, this is the first subtopic I'm going to hit, this is the next subtopic, this is the next subtopic. So your brain knows what to anticipate next. If you're reading the first subtopic and you suddenly have a question about what you're reading, you can say, hey, I already skimmed this. I know they're going to talk about this later in the textbook. I don't need to go back and reread and look for that answer. Next, you want to read the key points and the intro. So you want to read the first not the first paragraph, maybe the first sentence of each major heading. So it'll introduce you to what they're going to tell you about in that reading. And then you want to read the key points at the end, because those are the things that the author wanted you to take away. So you should skim over those too, so you have an idea of, hey, that was a key point. Maybe I should read this a little bit more intensely and actually focus on this reading and maybe write down all this information, because that's something they felt was really important. They put in a key point. You want to note anything in different formatting. Anything that's italicized, anything that's highlighted, anything that's bolded, in a graph, in a figure, in a table, anything that they set apart that jumps out in the page is probably an important piece of information you need to know. And finally, if you were to do that, you already did the last step. You skim all the graphs, tables, charts, and anything else that's not written paragraph material and think how they relate to your reading. The advantage of doing that is How many times have you read through a textbook and you're on a page and then all of a sudden you see a table and you weren't expecting a table, but you're halfway through a sentence and you say, oh my gosh, do I stop reading the sentence and look at the table? Do I finish the sentence and read at the table? Is this table about what I'm reading? Is it about what I read previously? Is it about what I'm going to read upcoming? I have no idea. This avoids that whole problem. You now know what's in the table. So you may be reading a subheading and you say, oh, there's a table coming up that talks just about this. Why don't I finish this section and then go look at the table? Or you may be reading through and there's a table underneath and you say, you know what? I remember not seeing a table about this. I bet this is about upcoming reading that's coming on. So why don't I finish this and just ignore that table on the page and focus on what I'm reading right now? The next step, question. This is why I asked you in the previous slide to read the key points at the end of the chapter. You need to develop questions for what you're reading. We know when people read quote unquote actively, they retain knowledge better. This is why your teachers give you pre-tests before you know the knowledge. What they're hoping is when you're studying, your brain starts to whisper, hey, that was a question that you need to know the answer to that you don't know. Maybe you should focus on this topic. That is the whole point of the question. You need to frame questions for what you're reading. So if you're reading a subtopic of a certain section, you may already know a little bit about it, and you may say, hey, I need to know what year this happened, or I need to know what the pathophysiology of this disease process is. You know, when I see it, I should probably write that down. Now you're actively reading. You're reading while you're looking for knowledge. Your brain is going to retain that better because your brain is creating those neural connections where you're going to be able to recall that information. So the two questions you should ask whenever you're questioning is, what do you want to learn and what are some parts of the topic you don't know? And what do you want to make sure you know when you are done? Those questions are pretty much told to you at the end of each section when they give that summarizing box. If you can answer the questions in the box, or if you can elaborate on the facts that are given in the box, then you obviously read enough to answer those questions. Reading. This goes to the Pomodoro Technique. You want to set realistic time and page number expectations when you read. You should tell yourself, hey, this is the major topic. This is 30 pages. I can't reasonably read this in one sitting. I should be able to make it through 3 subsections by the end of today. Now you set yourself a reasonable goal. It's hard for you to keep working when you give yourself an unreasonable goal. When you fail at the goal that you've set forward for yourself, you're negatively reinforcing the studying that you're doing. You're suddenly saying, oh man, I'm not good enough to make it to where I thought I would make it. You want to give yourself very realistic expectations on how much to read. Dividing the chapter into sections, bam, that's already done for you. You don't even need to worry about it. Just go by the way it's already been divided up. Ask your questions before you read each paragraph. That was the previous step. You already got that set up. Now all you need to do while you're reading is reading actively, either using highlighting techniques or notes. And we'll talk about both. I like notes better than highlighting. The data behind taking notes is better than the data behind highlighting. But that doesn't mean highlighting is bad. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It works for some people. You just have to use it well. Now, let's go to the next one. Recite. What does that mean? That means that when you finish a subsection or a page, you should be able to take your hand and cover up that page, and you should be able to get a good idea of what you just read. This goes to active reading. This goes to the Pomodoro Technique and hyper-focusing. If you cannot recall what you just read, you probably didn't read it well enough. If you can't tell immediately after reading a subsection or a page what was on that page, what was being taught, and what were the key points, you need to go back and read it again. You probably also need a break because your brain is probably burning out at that point. So how do you test yourself if you know? There's a lot of ways to do it. If you're a visual person, visualize what's on the page. Can you remember what was on the top left of that page? Can you remember what that table looked like and what the sections of the table were? You may not need to know what it is exactly word to word, but you should have a general idea of what you just read. You know, if you can't do it, go back and do it again. You know, this is the point where it says, do not pass go back and start over. Review. Once you're done with your reading for the day, or you finish that whole section, you need to go back and review, whether it's your highlighting or your notes or whatever it is, or if there's review questions at the end. This is different than reciting. Reciting is just saying, it's a self-check at the end of one page or one section that says, Did I actively read? Reviewing is actually testing yourself. Do I retain that knowledge? What do I know? For a lot of people, this is doing test questions at the end. This is, I finish a paragraph and there's 4 or 5 questions associated with the reading. I should do those questions. That's why you get assigned questions for reading in college, high school, middle school, grade school, because they want you to review it. Because we know when someone recalls knowledge that they just learned within the first 24 hours, they are far more likely to retain it a week out than someone who doesn't do it. How do we do that? We give people homework. We give them questions to do. Once you're an adult, you don't really get homework, but you should understand the concept behind it. You should understand that you should be able to recall what you just read and not only pull that knowledge, but reconstitute that knowledge in a separate way by answering a question. You can't rote memorize everything. You have to understand the concepts behind it, and this is what reviewing is testing you. So you want to go back and review, and then you want to make sure if there are topics you don't know well, okay, you're burned out, you study for hours, you can't retain anything else for the rest of the day, make sure you go back and look at it later. This is when you notate, hey, I never really got that concept that well. I did the reading, but maybe I need to go back and do it again. Maybe tomorrow I review my notes. This is when you identify it, not the day of the test and you miss the question, you realize I didn't actually learn the concept. So next topic, how do you highlight? This is very, very important. I'm going to say again, highlighting is not the best way to actively read, but it is also not the wrong way. You will hear people tell you, do not highlight. Highlighting is horrible. Highlighting is this horrible way to retain knowledge. No one ever gets anything out of it. That's not necessarily true. It is definitely not as good as actively writing something down and outlining or taking notes, but it is not this horrible thing that everyone makes it out to be. What you have to do is you have to highlight correctly. So you need to be critical of what you're underlining and highlighting. How many of you have gone through a textbook and you're studying and you realize you just highlighted a whole paragraph, or that page has more yellow on it than white on it? That means you highlighted incorrectly. You should not fill up a whole page with a highlight. You shouldn't run out of a highlighter partway through a chapter in a textbook. That is not how you use highlighting. If you're going to highlight everything, then don't highlight anything, right? You're in the exact same boat. You're basically just repainting the page. So first thing you need to do is you need to come up with a system for highlighting. There's a lot of ways to do it. You can do a color-coded system. A lot of people use different color pens, different color highlighters, and each color is associated with something. A key concept may have one color, a fact may have another, while a concept may have a third color. So when you see that color for the fact, that's something I have to memorize. There's no other way to learn it. You see a highlighted color for a concept, this is something I need to understand. I may not need to memorize the sentence, but I need to understand the idea behind it. You can do the exact same thing with shapes. You can use boxes, circles, stars, double underlines. However you want to. There's no standardized system. You can decide every single key fact that I need to know, I'm going to double underline. Every concept I need to know, I'm going to box. Every, subtopic that I'm struggling with, I'm going to star. So I know when I see a star, when I'm reviewing, that's something I need to go back and probably read that paragraph in detail because that's a concept I struggled with. Next, use the margins. Just because you're highlighting doesn't mean you shouldn't be writing stuff down. You should always have a pen with you. So when you're highlighting, you should use the margins. Why is there the 2-inch margin on a textbook? It's not so they could use up more paper and create a larger textbook. It's because they expect you to use the margins. You should be writing things down. You should be using that margin to write down keywords, key facts, say, oh, remember this. Focus on this table. Remember that this happens in this situation. That's what you should be using it for. If you've done it correctly, and you've highlighted correctly, and you look at that page at reviewing, not only should there be not a full page highlighted and covered in ink, you should be able to look at that page and say, there's a fact here, there's a concept here, there's something I need to review there. And then on the margins, there should be information. You say, oh, that fact, that's associated with what I wrote over there. I went into more detail because I remember I got something from a secondary source to back up that fact. Now, there are going to be situations where you're going to underline or highlight a lot. You should never underline or highlight more than one line on your reading, however that page is divided up. If you're going to highlight or underline more than one line, use brackets. If you use a bracket at the beginning and a bracket at an end. That way, you don't fill up a whole page with highlighting. When you see a bracket, you say, okay, there's a large amount of volume that's coming that I thought was very important. I bracketed it. Next, you should use brackets to your advantage. So you shouldn't bracket a whole page. If there's a very important page, if you write a bracket at the beginning and a bracket at the end, how do you know what's on that page? How do you get to that key concepts built in within? If it's teaching multiple points on a subtopic, you can number them. You can write 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can go A, B, C, D. That way hey, I got to this bracketed section, and that was multiple key concepts. I think there were 4 of them, and I think I know 1 and 2 well, but I don't know 3 and 4. Where is it? Oh, there, I wrote down number 3. I'll reread from this point forward. Use it to your advantage. You should not be rereading a whole page to look for a fact you didn't know. If you can't find that in your reading based off your highlighting, then you didn't highlight correctly. Finally, write down questions as you have them. You should always have a sheet of paper next to you when you're highlighting. If there are big questions that you don't know that you need to bring up in class, ask your professor, ask your faculty member, or read a different source material to figure out the answer, you should write that question down, because I promise you, at the end of a day of studying, you aren't going to remember those questions. When they pop up in your head, write them down somewhere. Next, let's go over how to take notes. Now, there's a lot of different concepts out there. I'm not going to focus a lot of time on what I call visual mapping or the basic outline. This is stuff you've learned in high school, kind of using indentations, using Roman numerals, numbers, dots, dashes, whatever it is, to kind of break up your note-taking. That's the basic outline. Visual mapping is people who are very visual learners. Sometimes it helps if they take a sheet of paper and write the main concept in the middle, then draw out arrows or lines and bubbles and show how this concept ties to that concept, ties to concept 1, concept 2, concept 3. Oh, by the way, concept 1 and 3 are related, so I'm going to draw a line between those two. That's for very visual learners. For people in medicine, you guys are probably the minority. So if you want to talk about this more in detail, we could definitely do a lecture on it, but it's not something I'm going to focus on today. Well, I'm going to focus on something called the Cornell Method. I find it very effective in people who are not only proficient note takers, but beginning note takers. It forces you to take notes the correct way. So how do you use the Cornell Method? You take a sheet of paper that is lined, whether it's college rule, wide road, whatever. At the top of that paper, there's already a white section. Preserve that, leave it there. That top section is for you to write down what the date, what the topic was, what the subtopic was. On this date of this year, I studied this and I studied this specific subtopic. This is what you're going to find when you look at this page. This is important when you review, because if you're trying to review something, oh, I know I studied it 3 months ago, you can find it by date. Or I know it's within the subtopic, you can find it by subtopic. That is how you kind of work your way through your notes, not just pages filled with writing and you're flipping through it to look for some note you wrote on some day and you knew you used a certain color pen or something. Now, the next thing you do, about 3 or 4 inches from the bottom, you draw a line horizontally all the way across. That bottom section is for you to summarize what you learned, and we'll talk about that. Then from the top box to the bottom box, about 2 or 3 inches in from the far left of the sheet, you draw a line down. So now you have a top section, a bottom section, a small left rectangle, and a big right rectangle. So we talked about what the top is for. That right rectangle, that's where you take your notes. So you're giving up, a good amount of real estate on your paper, but that's where you're writing, and that's where you do the basic outline, the indenting, the ABC, however you do it, however it's worked for you. There you should be writing key notes, important concepts, topics to memorize. Now, a couple important things. Do not write complete sentences. You should be writing in shorthand, something that you'll understand yourself. Don't rewrite the words on the page. Don't rewrite what the professor told you. Don't sit down and write it down word for word. As you're taking notes, you should be reconstituting the knowledge. This is why note-taking is so valuable, and this is why teachers love it. Because if you need to take a concept you just heard or learned and put it in your own words, you are automatically already starting down that path of retaining the knowledge. The bottom, when you get to the end of that page or the end of the lecture or the end of that chapter, you should go back and you should start writing in the bottom of each section. summarizing what your notes are. Really quickly jot down, oh, when I read this chapter, these are the key topics I talk about. This is what I learned. Oh, there's a concept here that I know I might forget, but I remember right now. Let me write that down real quick. The bottom of the page is for your high yield stuff. This is the stuff you use when you're sitting in the classroom 30 minutes before the test and you're flipping through your notes. You look at the bottom of your pages to see what are the big important concepts that I pulled up right at the end of my reading. What did I thought was important to retain? The left side, what do you use that for? Use that when you're studying. Use that when you go back and reread your notes. Let me say that again. When you go back and reread your notes, you should be going back and reading your notes. If you write it down and never look at it again, then what's the point of writing it down? You need to go back and read it again. So as you're reading it, if there's information that you recall, key concepts, or you have some epiphany and you realize some overlying idea as you're going through your notes, that's what the left side is for. It's also for you to kind of write down any questions that you have. You're reviewing, right? You're going through your notes and you realize, hey, even after reviewing, I still don't get this concept. I need to ask my teacher. I need to look up the answer to this question so I can understand this concept better. That's what the left side is for. The left side should not be filled out until you go back and you're back home or you're reviewing that chapter or that section again for a test or whatever it may be. You're going back and going over that information. So, remember when I told you first we're going to go back kind of through something similar to the SQ3R? This is where it is. It's called the 5 R's of note-taking. It is almost the exact same thing. It goes through record, write down the information that you read, reduce, use shorthand, minimum words, summarize, don't rewrite what you just read, recite, cover up what you wrote, can you remember it? You can do reciting as you're reading the textbook, or you can do reciting by summarizing at the bottom of the page with the Cornell Method. Reflect. This is at the very end, tying key concepts together. This is also when you use the bottom of the page. Is there a huge concept that ties everything together? Write that at the bottom. Review. This is the left side of the page. When you go back and you look at your notes again for the future. When you're going over them a week, a day, a month from now, and you're getting ready for that test, or you're going to reteach that concept to someone else in a study group. That is when you go back and review. And that is very important. A lot of people never review their notes. You spend all this time and effort writing this amazing outline down, taking a huge amount of information that's already distilled and someone thought was the best possible way to present, and you've distilled it even personally and further. And you've created an outline personalized for you that focuses on the things you don't know, focuses on things you know, written in a way that you understand and a style you understand. Why would you not go back and review that information? Right? That is information, that is high yield. That is stuff that you need to know and you thought you might not know, so you wrote down. So this is a personalized textbook, essentially, is what you have. Now, let's go through some basics on how you retain knowledge. The first step you need to do when you're looking at your reading on retaining knowledge is identify that piece of knowledge you want to retain. Is it a fact or is it a concept? This is very, very important because you would retain it in 2 very different ways. A fact, it needs to be memorized. These are numbers, these are percentages, these are dates, these are times, these are people's names. These are something that you really can't foreseeably reason out. A concept, that should be something you need to be able to teach to someone. So going back to the Pomodoro Technique, when I take my dog for a walk, sometimes sometimes you can't shut off your brain, I'll try to teach the concept to my dog as we're walking around the block. You'll hear me walking down the street teaching him some random medical concept to make sure I understand it well. Now, yes, that is kind of cheating in the Pomodoro Technique. You should clear your mind. But if your mind's going to be on the topic anyways, the way I say is you might as well take advantage of it. But really, that's what it comes down to. You should be able to teach that concept. The easiest way to see if you understand it, teach it to something. Teach it to your dog, teach it to, a teddy bear, teach it to the wall, teach it to your computer, whatever it may be. That act of recalling the knowledge and explaining the concept is helping you ingrain those neural networks that you're creating, those connections, recalling it. So when you recall it on the test, it's even quicker to pull up in your brain. It's no longer on the tip of your tongue, but you can't remember. Your brain's so used to pulling up that knowledge, it knows exactly where it is. So facts. How do you memorize facts? We'll go through some basic systems. This is something, each of these individual systems, we could probably spend a whole 1 hour lecture on each one of them. So I'm going to teach it to you in very basic concepts. If you want to know more information, there's a lot of information online. There's a lot of videos online on how to do it, or it's something that you could just kind of read about and teach it to yourself. So the first one is visual memorization. People who are visual learners tend to do well with this. This is the concept of a mind palace, in which you take a room you remember really, really well. Say your bedroom from childhood, your house from childhood. And you walk in through the front door or the main door of that room, and you look around. If you close your eyes, you can visualize in your mind. You know where the furniture is, you know the color of the wall, you know where the windows are, you know what the tree outside the window looks like. And then you start tagging facts and pieces of knowledge to those visual memories. If you're trying to remember, for example, what am I going to buy from the grocery store tomorrow? I need to buy milk. Visualize the idea of milk spilling on the couch or milk spilling on the carpet. I need to buy some eggs. Visualize eggs being thrown and the window getting egg and egg running all over it. You want to create unique images. Then you go to the store and you say, oh man, what do I need to get? Let me walk into my mind palace and look around. Oh yeah, the couch was covered in milk. That was horrible. Okay, I'll grab some milk. Yeah, the window was covered in eggs. There were eggs running all the way down it. All right, I need to grab some eggs. That's how you use that. Now that is to help you with some short-term memory and facts. You cannot memorize every single fact that way, but it puts it from your short-term to slightly more into your long-term memory. And as you recall it again and again, you remember it better and better. There's another system in place called the PEG system. It's a lot harder to use in medicine because our facts that we're remembering don't lend themselves well to a PEG system. They kind of lend themselves okay to a visual mind palace system. What a PEG system is you tie in pieces of knowledge to a preset PEG system you have. So for me, it's head, shoulders, knees, and toes. And within the head, I break it down to HEENT. So your head, your eyes, your ears, your nose, and your throat. So if I need to remember something to go to the grocery store, I throw it on the pegs that I already know. So let's say the milk again. I remember head is the first one. I'm pouring milk all over my head. I'm getting soaked. Now I'm not going to forget it. The next one is eyes. Oh man, I need to pick up some eggs. Let me think about, instead of eyes, I have eggs for eyes. That's such a weird concept, right? Or if I wear glasses. So if someone shoved eggs into my glasses and kind of smeared it all over, I couldn't see anything. Now you aren't going to forget it. And you could do that with the rest of your grocery list. The reason I use a grocery list for these examples is that's kind of the best way to memorize these facts. These facts don't really lend themselves, medical facts don't lend themselves to these types of memorization techniques. What you'll probably use 99% of the time is mnemonics. I'm sure any one of you right now can think of mnemonics. Now here's the dirty secret to mnemonics. The dirtier it is, the ruder it is, the more taboo it is, the better you're going to remember it. So I'm sure every single one of you has a mnemonic in the back of your head that is some horrible sexual reference or some really taboo concept or completely not politically correct. The reason you remember it is because it sticks out in your mind. That is the beauty of mnemonics. Mnemonics is a personalized system to you, and there's databases online that you can search for common mnemonics, but come up with a way to remember it. Tie it in with words, with a story, whatever it is. Roy G. Biv, everyone knows what that is. That's a mnemonic that's very, very common and easy to remember. That's the situation you want to get yourself to. And you will find that in making a mnemonic, you start to learn the facts. So just the act of making a mnemonic and coming up a way to remember certain facts, suddenly you realize you know those facts because you're recalling it. You're trying to use that information in a different way, and as your brain starts pulling that information over and over and over again through all different types of pathways, suddenly those pathways are getting reinforced and your brain is starting to remember that information. Concepts. I want you to focus on this. You need to recognize the difference between recognition and recollection. This is very, very important because this is where it's going to hurt you on a test. What is recognition? Recognition is when you're doing a multiple choice test and you see answer B and it pops up and you say, oh, I recognize that. Yeah, I remember reading about that. That is not the level of understanding you should have for a concept. What you should be at is recollection. which means as you're reading through that question, before you even get to the answers, you recall that fact and you say, oh yeah, the answer is this. The concept is this. I already know it. That is where you should be. A lot of people misinterpret recognition for recollection. The reason a lot of people do bad on standardized tests and they think they've studied is they're able to recognize a fact when it presents itself, but they aren't able to recall it when they need to. And any test question that requires you to go through a more than one-step cognitive process is going to call on recollection rather than recognition. And that is very, very important. And that is where you're going to stumble and get hurt. So don't fall into that trap. And you should always be able to recall a fact. You know, I know we're talking about concepts right now, but especially a fact, you should never rely on recognition for a fact. You should know a fact well enough that you could recollect it. And then finally, like I was saying, you should be able to teach a concept. You can teach it to an empty classroom. You can teach it to the chair next to you. Just choose an object and explain the concept to it. If you are struggling to explain a concept, or if you're struggling to say, if I taught that to a person, would they understand it? That probably means you don't know the concept well enough. It also forces you to recollect the concept rather than recognize the concept. So you kind of get a 2-in-1. You know, by teaching it, you guarantee that you have good recollection and you guarantee that you understand the concept. So going through all these techniques, hopefully what happens from this lecture is you guys go home today, tomorrow, whenever you study next, and you sit down and you work through these. I don't expect you to go through every single, method, SQ3R, the 5 R's of note-taking, highlighting a note, all tomorrow. Take one of the concepts, the Pomodoro Technique, or having good study hygiene, and implement it. And once you think you've got it down, take another one and try it out and see if it fits. Not every method works for everybody. If this is a method that you don't think helps you and you think you do it better, throw it out and don't use it. What I want to give you today is the tools in your toolbox to be able to go out and be successful in studying.